Hear the Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. John, chapter 6 from verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the signs and he had performed and healing those who were ill. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover Festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one of you to have a bite." Another of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in the place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. But now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he had said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. This is the word of the God.
Thanks be to God. Where our son and David and Jane's daughter live with their family, they had a monthly cafe church. Very enjoyable experience. Somewhat more informal than us. They start with refreshments, then move into worship with some new songs and a worship band made up of people as old as us, with violins, flutes, etc., etc. So there's hope left for us. Perhaps one day we might try something similar here. Let's see where God takes us on that. Anyway, the subject of the excellent talk from my equivalent, a licensed lay minister, I think is the correct description, was the feeding of the 5,000. I think there must be a week ahead of us in their lectionary readings. And no, I hadn't copied her sermon, but she started by giving an excellent modern rendition of the miracle seen through the eyes of the young lad speaking to his mother on his mobile phone, the young lad who'd got the 2 loaves, the 2 fishes and the 5 barley loaves. Now, I did wonder about trying to reproduce the sketch. She sort of got a baseball hat and put it on backwards and was acting. And I thought, yeah, well, I thought I might get that sort of reaction. I didn't want you to die of embarrassment, because I certainly would have done. But let me describe just briefly what the content of that conversation was. It was like sort of, hello, mum, yes, I've been to the shops. Yes, the food for supper. Yes, well, bit of a story to that. He had to explain why he hadn't returned and they were still waiting for their supper. He said that he'd fallen in with a large group of people listening to a travelling preacher called Jesus, and how when they were all beginning to feel rather peckish, one of Jesus's followers spotted his basket. Indeed, it was the only food available. He then gets into quite some detail about how his basket of food, his family's evening meal, and probably the only food they were going to have that day, got blessed by Jesus and then somehow fed thousands of people. Obviously squirming from the understandably agitated response of his mother, he then explains how they won't go hungry, as he's now got no less than 12 baskets of food gathered up after the al fresco picnic. So the family will get their supper for several days. And he concludes by saying, the miracle was all down to Jesus. It was a thought-provoking sketch, and I'm only sorry I couldn't replicate it for you. But it did get me thinking about the boy's attribution of the whole amazing event to Jesus. And I reread the story, which incidentally is the only miracle of Jesus reported in all 4 Gospels. There's an interesting pub quiz question for you. And I was particularly struck by verse 6, where it says, Jesus asked this only to test him, test Philip, for he had already had in mind what he was going to do. Jesus asked this only to test Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And the question Jesus asked Philip was, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, I think we can assume that Jesus and his followers didn't go about with vast sums of cash, and they could hardly take a trip to the nearest ATM to get some, even if the baker was still open. So Philip's answer was predictable, wasn't it, and understandable. He did a quick review of the situation, speedy back-of-the-fag packet calculation, and concluded it was quite an impossible proposition to feed so many people. A quite understandable response. Philip could be described, I suppose, as a glass half-empty person. But don't we have a smidgen of sympathy with him? By contrast, Andrew, who has stumbled across the lad with the family's groceries, at least comes up with something positive, even if it was quite inconceivable that such a small contribution would feed 5,000 plus people. He was clearly a glass half full person. And I found myself thinking just now, this is in addition to my earlier thoughts, that maybe Andrew's words were, well, Jesus, let's see what you can do. Recall, Jesus' plan was to test his followers, who had recently witnessed some amazing healings where Jesus had spoken about faith and the need for it. Well, we know the outcome. The crowd was not only fed, but had an abundance of food left over, and it was all as Jesus had planned. And we have to decide what was most important, whether it was the feeding of the 5,000, as important as that was, or the impact such a miracle had on his disciples, particularly Philip and Andrew, and on the crowd who ate their fill and who then followed Jesus, hoping to see more of the same. Let me knock one possible explanation on the head immediately. I've heard it said that really the story of this miracle was that there were lots of other people who brought their packed lunches as well, and that they all contributed. No, because the text clearly says that the 12 baskets of leftovers was related to the 5 barley loaves. Fortunately, it wasn't the fish that was left over. I think it might have been a bit smelly by then. It's a great story, isn't it? But what is its relevance to us today? It's not as if we need a repeat of the miracle, as I think there is probably enough at the back of the church this morning to feed a hungry congregation anyway. But I do feel an element of sympathy for poor Philip. He did what any sensible person would do. He looked at the facts and concluded that Jesus was asking the impossible. After all, it was Jesus himself who suggested that anyone who started building a tower before getting a quote was being unwise, in the context, that is, of assessing the cost of following Jesus. And as individuals, or as a collective group of worshipping believers, we would be unwise to embark on any project without forming a realistic assessment of the likely cost in resources and finance and our ability to meet it. That's the criticism that's been levelled at a lot of politicians recently, who make extravagant promises without any clear idea of how they're going to finance them. But by contrast, Andrew seems to see the possibilities, even if the odds are somewhat stacked against it. It may be my imagination, but there does seem to be an air of expectancy in his comment to Jesus, almost as if he's half expecting Jesus to do something spectacular. And based on recent experience of Jesus healing people and raising the dead, he clearly has some basis for that expectation. And if, as is suggested by Jesus' initial comments, this is all about faith, what does it teach us about the way Jesus works? Does he expect 100% faith from us before he can act? It might be easy to think he does, and to use that as an excuse when it appears that Jesus doesn't answer our prayers in the way that we'd like him to. But my interpretation of the distinction between Philip and Andrew is that whilst Andrew still foresaw problems, he more specifically saw the possibilities. And that was faith, even if it wasn't total. Jesus was able to do more than Andrew realistically expected. Just as Paul describes Jesus as being able to do more than we can ask or imagine. And not just more, but immeasurably more. Paul's comment is related to us because he relates the outcome to us, specifically, and I quote, according to God's power that is at work within us. Andrew, by contrast to Philip, had detected the possibilities because of his experience of seeing Jesus at work. And that germ of faith was enough for Jesus to work miracles. And let's face it, as the sketch I saw last week said, this whole amazing event was down to Jesus. So back to my question, what about us? And what does this story mean for us? Are we facing intractable obstacles, either personally or collectively, as a church? Don't let me discourage you from looking at the situation objectively and taking a realistic view. But do we replicate Philip, who saw only the problem, or Andrew, who saw the possibilities, and specifically Jesus' ability to act in an amazing way? It's easy to get discouraged, personally and collectively, as a worshipping community. We've sadly lost a key member of our worship leadership in our organist, Margaret. But as Christians, we're facing unanticipated opposition in a number of areas. People are predicting an early demise of the church as we know it. The problems and obstacles sometimes seem very great. But do we just see the obstacles, or do we see the opportunities, as Andrew did? Personally, are we feeling so overwhelmed by circumstances or difficulties we may face in following Jesus? Opposition from skeptical friends and family or colleagues at work? How much time are we spending seeking to know what Jesus wants in those difficult situations, rather than what we might want? And then being an Andrew and relying on Jesus to turn possibilities into realities. Be encouraged. For me, this miracle is all about how Jesus can take completely unpromising situations and transform them if we just have enough faith to see the possibilities and move forward with that smidgen of faith that Andrew showed. The boy whose family shopping was used to feed 5,000 plus got 12 baskets back. But he got even more than that. He came face to face with Jesus, who could transform anything and everything. Let's believe he still can.